The upper arm, where do we begin? Well, why don't we think about the upper arm in the way, hold on. It's out of my peripheral vision, or out of my forehead anyway. Why don't we think about the upper arm as the simplest of shapes first, this two-dimensional rectangle. And then take that two-dimensional rectangle and then turn into a three-dimensional cylinder. The more that you can use this as a way of simplifying how to develop the upper arm into more complex anatomical reference and shapes, right, the easier that situation is going to be. Because again, remember, this thing is only going to be useful in relationship to how it attaches to your torso. So again, remember, we've got a rib cage that's coming into the torso, something like this, right? And you've got a scapula that's sitting inside that rib cage, something, or on top of that rib cage, something like that. And then your humerus, right, upper arm bone, is basically sitting in here like that. And so there's an interaction between your upper arm and your shoulder that we've gone over fairly significantly at this time, right? Where if we're pulling the arm in this direction, right, your pectoral is moving with it, your deltoid is attaching to that upper arm at about the 1/3 mark, and your lats from the backside are also attaching to the front of the arm. So that's all pulling that information in that direction, right? And then your upper arm is obviously, or the muscles of your upper arm is just interweaving with all of that stuff. But all of that stuff can be simply represented, right, in terms of the arm, or sorry, rather, the arm can be simply represented in its interaction with all of that stuff just by one of these two shapes, right? And the more that you use this, the easier that interaction is going to become. Now, one thing to think about the arm, especially with, is how it relates to the deltoid. And so again, if we look at the arm from the side, your deltoid, and think about the shoulder as this simplified volume, your trapezius sitting in up on top of it, your deltoid basically looks like this. I mean, it's kind of a teardrop that sets up on the side of it. Now, as you know, if we look at the arm from the back, your deltoid, or your trapezius, attaches all the way along that scapular spine. Oh, hold on, let's get that in frame. And your deltoid comes essentially to the 2/3 mark of that scapular spine, and then wraps around the deltoid, or wraps around the cylinder of the upper arm to go to the outside of the upper arm. And where it points down in the upper arm is roughly down the middle of the outside. Okay, so one way of getting better at drawing the upper arm is thinking about its relationship to the deltoid, because the same thing is going to happen from the front, where when we're drawing this deltoid, that upper arm, or that deltoid, is wrapping around the upper arm to the outside of the upper arm. So one way of getting better at drawing the arm from the front, back, side, right, whatever, is to think about the arm as a three-dimensional volume and how it interrelates with the deltoid. And think about that deltoid as wrapping around the cylindrical volume. And so if I'm looking at it from the front or the back, right, we're practicing drawing that type of shape. And all that really is differing when you draw the deltoid from the front or the back, right, is how long this muscle is going to be, right? So from the back, it's going to be slightly longer. From the front, it's going to be slightly shorter. And then what information you're tucking in underneath it. If this is from the back, right, we're looking at putting your triceps in like that. If this is from the front, we're looking at putting your bicep in like that. And then the remainder is the bit of bicep that you can see from the back, or the bit of tricep that you can see from the front. So just drawing this, actually even simpler, just getting used to drawing this. Doesn't even have to relate to a muscle. It'd be like you could use the exact same thing for, say, drawing rope. As that shape wraps around a cylindrical volume, that's going to help you draw the deltoid and, as a result, the upper arm itself. Now, what we've already got for the upper arm, if we say just because this is the easiest way to talk about it. If we look at the upper arm from the back, again, we can't disassociate the upper arm from the torso in the sense that that deltoid overlaps that upper arm to such a degree. But what we've already got is kind of a standard formula for the upper arm. That standard formula is high outside, low inside in relationship to your triceps. Now your triceps, the main bulk of them is going to occur up here. And all of that goes underneath your deltoid. And remember, to a large extent, goes over your shoulder muscles as well, because your shoulder muscles are moving forward, just as is your lat, towards the front of the arm. And so that interaction that we've already gone over is still the case. Now the back of your arm, even though there's this major bulge here, this section of the arm here is easier treated as a flat section, because all of your triceps essentially combine into a common tendon that attaches to, okay, and this is another key landmark or another key shape for the back of the arm, something that looks roughly like a triangle. We need to talk a little bit about bones in order for this to make sense. If you look at your arm just skeletally, your upper arm looks like this, right, at the elbow if you're looking at it from the back, which again, right, as we've gone over, forces your hand out into this position. Okay, so that upper arm and lower arm are significantly, or have a significant interrelationship with each other. Now, why this is important is because these two bones here essentially form these parts of the triangle, right, that sit at the end of this tubular shape. And all we're doing is overlapping this ball, essentially, over top of this top half of that shape to represent the belly of the upper sections of all three of the triceps. This section, though, is created by the forearm. Well, why do you keep doing that? Right, so this section here is your elbow, right, that bony part right there. Now, as we've kind of discussed, like briefly to begin with, or up until this point, this bone has to be attached to this bone here. So if you follow this all the way along the tattoo to that, that's an easy way of interrelating upper arm and lower arm to each other. And key, right, on that interrelationship is going to be the elbow. Easy way to think about the elbow from certain positions is going to be this triangular shape. This section here essentially nestles in there like that on the back of the arm. Right? And then if we track that down in this position, that has to connect to your pinky side, right? So this is your ulna, right, aka pinky side. So those two things attach to each other like that. So that forms a rough triangle, right, that becomes really, right, apparent in certain positions, right? So if I do this, right, with my arm, for example, that triangle becomes really obvious, right, and the peak of that being, right, what's called your olecranon process. And now the important part of this is that these triceps that form this high outside, low inside relationship, where did I draw it? Where did we draw it? Okay. Do come down and then they attach, right, to the to your forearm, right? But effectively look like they attach to the outside of your upper arm, or the inside of your upper arm. Now these muscles here create a volume more like that there, and then this flattens out. There is a really thin line of muscle here, but you can essentially ignore that. All of this is essentially flat inside that area. Right, so this is the easiest position of the arm because it's got really easy to identify landmarks. Right? And the front of the arm is equally easy. Again, if you think about that, as having your deltoid come over top of that, none of that changes. This simplified shape still remains the same. Right? Now your pectoral is overlapping this. You can see a little bit of this chunk of your tricep sticking out on this side, and a little bit of these muscles sticking out on the inside. All of this stuff is bicep, right, and a muscle underneath it called your brachialis that are both engaged in the flexion of the arm. Now this triangle, even though you can't see this bone obviously from the front, what you can see is the bottom of the belly of this muscle, and as it interrelates with your forearm muscles, which again on the thumb side are doing this, and on the pinky side doing this. And from the inside, what that means is that as this overlaps the upper arm and comes down into your lower arm, and as this attaches to this thing here, the belly of those two muscles, in coordination with the belly of these two muscles, creates kind of a hollow on the inside of the elbow. So that triangular section is, again, a really nice way to start to essentially attach more complicated anatomy, or imply rather more complicated anatomy. Okay, so that upper arm, both from the front and the back, is hardly different than anything that we've done up until this point. The only thing that might help, right, turn it into something a little bit more complicated is just adding some contour lines to that in order to flush that section out, but then also looking for this value or shape rather at the bottom of that. And where things get a little bit more complicated is, right, when we look at the pose from, or the arm from the outside, right, especially as the arm starts to twist into a position like this. Your upper arm bone from the outside, right, we can think about it as not dissimilar from your femur, actually, where it's kind of got a little bit of a bend to it, but that bend moves towards the bicep side. Right? And your deltoid essentially sits here and points towards that halfway point of your upper arm. Your triceps wedge in behind that, and your biceps and your brachialis sit on top of that. So your brachialis is an underlying muscle. You generally don't see a whole hell of a lot. Right? This is the thing that will kind of mimic what the upper arm bone is doing and help to exaggerate, in some instances, right, the volume of the bicep. So in a really simple version of the outside of the arm, we might have a contour like this. In a slightly more complicated contour of the upper arm, you would find this halfway point towards those 2 points, right? And then you'd have a contour that is essentially divided up into 2, and then an even more complicated version of the upper arm. You'd again find that halfway point, but that halfway point now creates a channel that separates bicep, brachialis, right, and tricep, right, into 3 distinctly different shapes that I've made indistinct because of the size of and lack of exaggeration of my contour. Now, this halfway point, right, not only tells you where that outside arm, or where that outside muscle is, or this underlying muscle is, tells you where your deltoid is attaching. It also tells you where this muscle has to attach, because that muscle is coming up and overlapping those 2 muscles and attaching to the outside of the arm. Now, the important part of this is that now this then creates a really obvious step on the outside of the arm. And so you can see that really clearly here. Right? That's the outside of this bone that sets up a nice landmark to then set up this as essentially a reflection of the same thing. This is this seen from the outside, right? So again, you can see like that there's that really clear step there. This then flattens out from the outside. This flattens out from the outside because this is all bone. And then the bulge of the tricep goes in behind that for the most part, right? Because what you're going to be able to see from this side is this section of the tricep. And that section is, again, best set up by another sort of L that points from the underside of the belly of that muscle along this really thin muscle towards that point right there. So what we get is essentially a series of L's and a series of triangles that are all kind of helping to lock this stuff in to position. And that's even more so when we start to incorporate the tricep, or sorry, the scapula into that as it disappears right underneath your deltoid. Now, we'll get more into this when we deal with the forearm next week. But if you take that exact same position of the arm and look at it from the inside and say, open the arm up, like that. Well, now again, that deltoid is going to be moving toward your front deltoid is going to be moving towards the outside of the arm. So that's going to be wrapping around the bicep. Your bicep and your tricep basically divide right down the middle again. And again, this muscle is kind of smushed on top of the line of your humerus, and your humerus again sits right about here. Now that, there you go, that becomes that bone right there. And you can see it's like there's a light indication of another L that occurs there. That points towards this muscle, or this bone rather, goes towards your radius. Now, this is a little bit more difficult to register, right, because it basically goes subterranean under muscles. Right? This arm, or this bone, is really easy because it's always pushing up against the surface of the skin. What doesn't change, though, is the fact that that L is then mirrored by another L at the base of your elbow. And this space here now gets carved up into two different triangles. Those two different triangles essentially look like this. And then this underside gets turned into this long, slow curve of this tricep. And so now, for the most part, you're not going to be able to see, right, this division, right? But it's important to recognize, right, that that's what's happening, right? Because every once in a while, you will start to see this, right? In this area will start to become confusing in terms of its contour. Likewise, right, to add to that confusion, you've got your back muscles, again, coming up over top of your arm, right? And then interdigitating, right, with that muscle, right, and your whatchamacallit, that tiny triangular muscle, your brachialis. This is your brachialis, and then this is your bicep. Now, all of this stuff comes down and attaches to your forearm, and then interrelates with the bulge of your flexors here. So really common positions of that section of the arm. This is a decent page to screenshot before I flip. So a really common position of the inside of the arm would be, say, something like this. Any position where the arm is held out towards the side. Right? And you have to figure out how to interrelate that with the torso. Well, the first part, again, is to figure out what the shoulder is doing, how the clavicle, right, is working, and then how this, if we're looking at it from the front, forces the deltoid out towards the outside of the arm, right? And that deltoid and pectoral essentially move in and create a single type of shape. Keeping that upper arm really simple. Dividing that space up in half, knowing that that tent is again going to be, of the flexors, is going to be going to the outside of the arm. And now looking for this triangle at the base of this shape, that triangle being a rough depression at the base of this halfway point. This is a little bit too exuberant. Now breaking this space up into that half, adding this curve there, knowing that this comes over top of that and then interrelates with that. This then gives you different variants of this overall shape. Simple contour, right, for less definition. More complicated contour for slightly more definition. And then more complicated contour again for even more definition. Right? And in each one of those instances, all I'm doing is adding this on to that position. The difference comes in here. Where we start looking at the differences, right, of contour in when it comes in touch with differences of definition. Really common version of the arm from, say, another position would be, say, something like this. Where we've got the arm kind of moving away from us. That. Well, if I find that halfway point, I can find that, which means that I can find this, which means that I can accentuate that. As we get into the forearm next week, this will then force this muscle to do this, and the other muscles that attach here to do this. This shape now becomes something more like that as it flattens out until it hits this point here, which has to go there. That's what we'll try to draw down. Yeah, so not dissimilarly from the knee, right? You can think about the elbow almost from this position as being sort of a box that you don't really want to draw, right? Even though that it's there, right? In the sense that your elbow is going to be here, and the side of your arm is going to be there. And the triangle just sits on the bottom of that box. So rather than just continuing with this, right, that's a decent page to screenshot, right, as well. Em, could we fire up your camera? And we'll do 2 different demos, I think. One with your arm from the front, like bicep facing, and the other one with your arm from the inside, bicep open, like this. Yeah, so just hanging loosely at your side, and then one kind of like tucked behind your head. Yeah, and then the other, we'll just do the same thing from the reverse.
Sure. Do you want a close up?
Yeah, maybe half body.
Half body? Sure. Give me a sec then. Hold on. Whoa, whoa, whoa,
Oh, hey.
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
Yui boom. I recognize that sound anywhere. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so again, as is usual, none of this affects your gesture, right, at all. And this is where the underlying information about your torso starts to come in particularly handy. Okay, so now as I start to break this stuff up, again, even though we got more information here, so we're trying to make this as simple on, you're trying to make this as simple on yourself as possible. Right? So that's the value of using that shape, like that. That's also the value of using this shape, like this, so that I'm essentially ignoring any sort of directional change on that arm at all in favor of locking in more complex structures so that it can't go anywhere now that I've got that shape locked in, right? Common mistake, right, in terms of like changing the structure of the arm is trying to do too much structure too early. Is like all this anatomical stuff only really helps at a certain point. Right? Because now that I've got that simple shape that all that anatomy has to be based on, or it has to be corresponding to, that deltoid has to do this. The pectoral has to do that. Your bicep is essentially just that leftover shape. And then the change of direction that you see here is that bone, right, that's pushing up against the surface underneath it, right? So well, rather than changing direction, what I'm doing is adding a chunk of space there. Likewise, that triangle that I was talking about, you can kind of loosely start to see developing here, right? This triangle points towards this inside section of the wrist. It also communicates an easy or a slightly easier way of identifying where this overall shadow starts to take place. Right? And this softening here is the slight bulge of the flexors that you can see over top of that shape that essentially comes in contact with the bone of your radius here. This slight bulge here, right, are your extensors that are coming up to the outside of your upper arm and that are also twisting around your arm, and we'll get more into this next class. Those things have to then come over top of the arm to there. Now the important, like that's useful, I'm not gonna lie to you, I mean, that's useful information to know, right? But none of that changes that stuff that you do to begin with. And all of that is just this in terms of an addition there, this in terms of an addition there, and this in terms of an addition there. Right. The rest of that is that, or in this there. The rest of that is that really simple shape that I started off with. Right. So again, the less that you do, right, to change the structure of that arm from those simple shapes at the beginning, the better. Same thing with this more complicated position of the arm. We've already gone over similar positions of this with respect to the torso, right, and our discussions about the shoulder, right, about how that pectoral, right, and deltoid essentially become the same shape here. These initial shapes, right, help to simplify that area. Finding the halfway point now of that upper arm, right, knowing that your rib cage has to go underneath here, that your lats and shoulder muscles have to come up like that. And now that your triceps have to go in behind there, and that your upper arm is going to be coming down like this and effectively creating two bumps or two L's that move off in that direction. And then the bulge of your flexors help to create not only this shape here, but also the smushing of your bicep and your flexors together as they come in contact with that. And then this overall contour there. Now, all of this is in the service of, again, making your drawings more interesting to look at and easier to put in the details of. Because now once I've got those things in and you get familiar with them, these shadow shapes that start to identify the musculature underneath the arm, those become a lot easier to put in. Right? And as a result, it becomes a lot easier to start to put in graphic overlaps, to accentuate certain areas. And also use that underlying information to not necessarily have to do anything, right, to those areas. Okay, so these details and these contour lines, right, or these structures in these contour lines aren't details in and of themselves, they're guidelines towards details, right, that you might then be you're using as a way of putting in a more confident edge line. Or more confidently put in the shadow shapes of that area and accentuate them. Or, you know, as would be a really useful way of detailing this area of the pose, not do anything to it and just leave those structures much the same way that I've left this area. Right? And then have that communicate detail in a different type of way. Emily, can we do the exact same pose, but maybe switch arms for the sake of your arms from the back? Yeah, that'd be great. Actually, shit. Oh yeah, that's better. Perfect. That's just a little bit more in the light. Perfect. Okay, so again, gesture. That's good. We get some more complicated positions of the arms for application purposes. So again, don't diminish the importance or overlook the importance of how the torso makes it easier to actually deal with the arms, because the only way that you're going to attach this to this accurately is having a rough idea of how this is twisting space. Again, though, simplifying the arm, right, into those basic shapes, regardless of the position that it's in. Right, but now again, thinking about this as a three-dimensional shape, right, that in this position is moving like this, and then this as another three-dimensional shape. It's moving like this. And then inside that three-dimensional shape, we've got junction points. So here we've got, drew that wrong again, nice job, Joe. Here we've got a volume that's moving kind of like that, which means that this overall volume of that section of the trapezius is going to look, or sorry, your tricep is going to look like this. And your deltoid, because it has to, again, be on the, relate to the outside of your arm, that deltoid has to be going in behind your tricep and attaching to the outside of the arm. This section of the tricep now coming down to this junction point of the elbow, the other junction point of the elbow sitting in here, and then all of this stuff of the tricep then has to extend into that point. So all of this overlap is shoulder muscle, the other one's going to the front of the arm. All of this stuff is bicep. Right? And that bicep having to overlap your forearm from that position, which means that this section here is a little flatter, this section here a little rounder, and then moving into a fully round section, and then this section here being an entirely different muscle. This bone here has to attach to your pinky side, and because the pinky's up against, right, the surface of the hip there, that means that those two things have to go up against each other, which means that all of this is flexor stuff here. And this is where a little more anatomical knowledge does come in handy, because that basically forces information from one point into another point. So again, this now provides me a guideline for how I might overlap those lines. And then a much clearer idea of where this shadow shape starts to change direction as it wraps around those different muscles, right? And then also how this bone here, that muscle there, and this muscle there have to overlap each other. Same thing here. This would be there, that would be there. This is about your halfway point. The scapular spine is going to be tilting up like that, which means your deltoid is going to be stretching around with it, right, and smushing up like this. And that's what's creating these creases there. The tricep is getting pulled all the way along here, but your back muscles are going up over top of a good chunk of it. Halfway point then gives us a way of identifying the volume of this and where this attaches. And in this instance, the only thing that that really helps us out with is why this shadow changes direction as it starts to wrap around that midpoint of the arm. Forearm muscles and stuff left for the other, or for another day. Again, this is the exact opposite of this, where even though I can see this bone and know that it's attached to the pinky, because I can't see the pinky side of things here, now you're just dealing with thumb stuff from that section. Thank you, Emily. That was great. Okay, so again, right, hopefully that comes across, like how these simple shapes, right, are used to create more complicated stuff. Right? Try to avoid the temptation of going into more complicated stuff first. Right? It really will, once you get familiar with the process, the formula, become significantly easier to think about developing any particular area, right, in the structural sense. Okay, so you might want to, as a cheat sheet, so to speak, keep this up against or up on your screen while you're drawing, and then essentially just try to get better and better at applying that stuff and things to the stuff and things. My vocabulary, I've been working on it the last couple of weeks, and alternative ways or other ways of developing your observational skills for making your drawings accurate. Basically convincing your brain that what you see is actually what you see as opposed to what your brain thinks that it sees. And your brain, distorts stuff for a variety of reasons, either familiarity or unfamiliarity or simplicity or iconography, right, et cetera. So there's lots of, I'd say about 100 years of psychological research now, right, based on exploring how the brain distorts what you actually see into stuff that makes more sense to it. So these tools, right, some of them we already have, right? Your vertical and your horizontal plumb line are two tools to prove the existence of things in relationship to each other in a way that is more accurate, as opposed to what it is that you might actually see. So these are just two tools amongst many, and they're all in the service of making things a little bit more accurate. Now, what your vertical and your horizontal plumb line, again, just remember, is they tell you what's above and what's below 2 points of reference. So let's say that you've got a shoulder here and another shoulder here, and you measure somewhere from about the middle of them, and that's going to tell you that those two things first off line up on top of each other. But then what it might also tell you is that, let's say that your head is kind of stacked up on top of there, that if you took another horizontal plumb line from the bottom of your chin and compared it to the top of your shoulder, that there would be this vertical gap. Right? One way or the other, the chin would have to be above the shoulders as opposed to below. Likewise, if I had an arm draped directly down next to the torso, and this elbow happened to line directly up underneath that, a vertical plumb line would prove that information to me. But likewise, if I then had my arm kind of like palm out so that the natural angle of the elbow would force the arm out to the side like this, that this vertical plumb line would then tell me that this stuff had to be out to the left of it. And then likewise, it would tell me other stuff that would line up directly with it, right, or in varying positions relative to it, depending on where this vertical plumb line tells me that this particular thing is. Now, this is all good, right? And the way that this essentially dovetails with generic proportion is that generic proportion, when we're dealing with an unforeshortened, right, or unprospectively distorted type of element in the body, it allows us to basically place these things a little bit more accurately. What this doesn't help with is that we're going to get away from this generic proportion and into more specific points of reference, but also right into things like foreshortening or perspective distortion, where now this formulaic representation doesn't tend to work. So what we need is an alternative way of setting proportion, because this tells me that this thing and this thing line up directly above each other on a vertical line, or with respect to a horizontal line. It says nothing about how far away these things are from each other. So another way of doing this is what's called point mapping. Point mapping is essentially kind of like connect the dots, right? Except you're creating your own dots as you go along. It was developed by an English dude at the beginning, I think it was beginning of the 1800s, beginning of the 19th century. Maybe it was the end of the 18th century. I can never remember this guy's name. Anyway, doesn't matter. Point being, when you're developing these points, you're essentially developing a geometric grid. And then whatever that geometric grid tells you about the pose is essentially what has to be happening with the pose, because, math. So let's say that I wanted to find the exact proportion, right, of where that elbow is. To begin with, you need a place to start. So let's say that this is your pose. And based on your gesture, your shoulder is going to be, in some sort of position. And then coming straight across from that shoulder, along that horizontal plumb line, you then basically choose, based again loosely on your gesture, where that shoulder is along this angle. So the point of this is that this first and second point of reference, that's essentially arbitrary, meaning that that distance can be absolutely anything. And what this does is it sends a sense of scale to your drawing. So let's say that I've got my gesture. My gesture is something like this. identifying a loose idea of what that pose looks like. Well, to begin with, I know loosely based on my gesture that this shoulder has to be right about there. And that, again, loosely based on this gesture, that this shoulder has to be about there. And, because of taking a horizontal plumb line to compare those 2 points together, that they exist along a horizontal axis. Now, you're setting proportion here, again, arbitrarily, but also based loosely on that generic proportion that we've been going over. Now, let's say that you wanted something more accurate than generic proportion. You now have 2 points of reference that set the scale, how big your drawing is going to be, right? How big your sketch is going to be. What you need now is everything else, every other point of reference that you establish inside the pose or inside your drawing, to now refer back to that scale. So for purposes of illustration, what I mean by points of reference right now is just your major joints. Because we can do this on a really loose scale, which are the major joints will provide. We can also do this on a really kind of minutia type of scale. If I want to know where this elbow is, I can take a vertical plumb line straight down from that elbow or from that shoulder to where that elbow is. Now, again, when you're measuring from this point to that point, this is why it gets a little bit nebulous, is because when you measure from an elbow or a shoulder, there's no specific spot that you're necessarily measuring from or to, right? So here I'm measuring roughly from about where the middle of that generic volume would be and where to the middle of this generic volume. So there's going to be a little discrepancy, but it's just a bit better than guessing. So if I want to do that, I can tell that this thing and this thing line directly up over top of each other. But again, I don't know how far away those things are from each other. So if I want to find out more accurately, now I take what's called a compared angle. Basically, I take my pencil and place it with respect to both of those points of reference. Right? So taking the angle of the pencil and placing it one end at the shoulder, one end at the elbow, and then bringing that angle over, comparing it to this shoulder that I've already drawn, and then physically drawing that angle down, and then double checking so that there's as little disagreement when I transfer this from here to here as possible. Where those two lines cross over gives me the position of that elbow. This is called triangulating the pose, where essentially it's like tacking back and forth. If you've ever, for those of you who have ever gone sailing, which I have done like exactly once or twice in my life because of exactly this. If you've got point A to point B and you're sailing, right, you want to go from here to here, but you can't do that, right, because you got to catch the wind and all that shit. So you got to go over here, and then you got to go over here, and then you got to go over here, and then you got to go over there, and then you got to go over there, and eventually you get here. This is kind of like that. So if I want to find out where this elbow is here on this arm that's loosely gestured out like that, run out of room. Always running out of room. I can take an angle from this elbow or this shoulder to that elbow. And loosely draw that angle down. Double check that angle so that if it's inaccurate, which very likely it is going to be, especially if you're not familiar with this, you now at least have something down that you can compare that back to. So that when I take this angle again and place it back up here, now I've got a point of reference to tell me that the angle is not actually this, it's actually that. That angle discrepancy might not be a big deal to begin with, but the more that you refer back to an incorrect place in your drawing, the less correct that drawing becomes as a result. So now let's say that that elbow is here. I don't know where that is. No, I only know this angle. If I want to find that other angle, now I can, or if I want to find that more accurately, I take an angle from this elbow to that elbow. Take that angle over here, physically draw it down, double check that angle, and then where those two lines cross over gives me the position of that elbow. If I wanted to be really accurate about it, I could take another angle from this shoulder to this elbow, and wherever that, and if those two measurements agree, when I draw this angle, if I've got 3 measurements that tell me the position of that thing, I know that I'm probably on the right track. Now, again, there's going to be discrepancy because where you're measuring to and from in this major type of way just gives you a really basic idea of accuracy or a greater degree of accuracy. It doesn't give you something really granular. Okay, so this is a really useful tool to have, say, in like a 5-minute pose, where it allows you to develop the pose a little bit more accurately than you would be just kind of guesstimating. Because essentially now all you're doing is rinsing and repeating with the remainder of the pose. So Tiffany, would you mind firing your camera back up and taking on a 5-minute pose? And I'm going to put this in the practice as opposed to talking about it theoretically. Because what I'll do in the second half of class is I'll go over this in the more granular way of doing it. EOS webcam utility. Brought to you by EOS webcam utility.
1 second.
There you go.
And any pose that's comfortable for you for 5 minutes is totally great. Perfect. Okay, so even when we're trying to be more accurate, we need something to start with. And that's where your gesture comes in. It's much easier to correct something, at least with the time limit that we have available to us, say 5 minutes, 15 minutes, or etc., than it is just to start from scratch. So even though all we're going to be doing with this is correcting it in a more robust manner, just like with everything we've been doing up until this point, we need this as a start point, so to speak. Okay, but again, you're not putting too much time into this because all you're going to be doing is correcting this. Now you need again a place to start. Clusters of chunks of information are really good. There's knee, ankle, elbow, wrist, right? That's good. Right? Elbow, shoulder, that's good. Torso's not so great, right, for this if you're just doing it loosely, because the areas are too big to refer back to. So let's say I'm going to just arbitrarily start with that shoulder. That shoulder, based loosely on my gesture, is there. Take an angle with respect to, and this is something that you'd be doing on the pose. It doesn't really translate very well on camera. You'd be comparing shoulder to shoulder, right, or shoulder to elbow, so to speak. So that's what I'm doing with Tiffany's pose, right? And Tiffany's shoulders are about that angle with respect to each other. Okay, so now what I've done by establishing this and this, I've now established the scale of the pose. If I want to now identify where this elbow is accurate, take another angle from here to here, where those two things are, have to exist along that angle. I'm double checking that angle. And then developing volume, but I don't know where that elbow is. I don't know how far along that angle it is. So now I have to take another angle from here to there. Where those two lines, drawing that angle down, right? Double checking that angle. Where those two angles line up or cross over with each other gives me the position of that elbow. Now I can do the exact same thing with the wrist. Taking an angle from elbow to wrist. Right, and now because this angle is so shallow from here to here, this actually ends up being a really difficult angle to do because of one of those irritating things that your brain tends to do. When this angle and this angle and this angle are so similar to each other, it tends to conflate those things and combine them. So what we want is something a little bit more distinct. So an angle from here to here is actually a little bit easier for your brain to treat as a totally separate thing. And again, same thing, double checking. So where those two lines cross over gives me that position. So now that hand has to be there. This makes it super, or wrist has to be there. This makes it super easy to block in not only the hand, but also the knee, because now those things have to be wedged up against each other like this, which makes it significantly more easy to come over here and now draw this ankle, because I can now take an angle from here to that ankle, take another angle from this shoulder to that ankle, where those two lines cross over gives me the position of that ankle, and as a result, also where that foot has to start. If I go up from here to this knee, take an angle from ankle to knee, double check to make sure that I'm kind of right. Change it if not. Take another angle from the original shoulder to that same knee. Right, and you can see that that knee shifted in a little bit. This makes it really easy to draw this elbow because that elbow has to be there. Taking an angle from here to here confirms that. And as a result, now I have that position there. Taking an angle from this elbow to this wrist. I now know that that has to exist there, and taking a horizontal plumb line straight across from this shoulder to that wrist to show me that those two things line up. Sort of like that with respect to each other. This now makes it a lot easier for me to start to fill in the blanks, so to speak. Right? What does this chunk of negative space inside of here look like? Right? And this will be part of the more granular discussion, because now I've essentially forced all of these controlling joints in and around that area to exist inside of a certain spot. So I've basically limited the amount of shit that can go wrong with the drawing. Likewise, I can guesstimate how big that chunk of negative space is there. I can tell that this foot is wedged up underneath that foot, and as a result, has to be something like that, because I've closed this space down with the position of the two legs. I can now draw this area a little bit more accurately. I've now closed this space down with the position of the breast so that I can draw the top of the stomach as it comes across into this other chunk of negative space. And then I'm trying to draw this space as accurately as possible. So basically, the more stuff that you put down, right, and this is again why the gesture is so important, the easier it becomes to actually start to correct what it is that you're drawing. Very difficult to draw out of nothing. So the gesture solves that problem. But once you make this decision in terms of where that initial section is going to be, it also makes the remainder of the drawing a lot easier to do. Because now you have stuff to compare back to. Okay, so this is something that is, if my sense of time is getting back to normal, is entirely possible inside 5 minutes, and is going to be something that's crucial to do inside, say, 15 or 20 minutes. Thank you, Tiffany, that was great. Okay, so this has nothing to do with details. This has everything to do with setting the stage for where details are now going to exist, because now essentially you've eliminated proportional problems. It doesn't mean that you can't screw the drawing up from this point. There's still lots of ways to make that happen at every stage. But what it does mean is at least that proportional problem is taken care of. Okay, so what I would like you to try is that we're going to do 2 10-minute poses. Okay? I'd like you to gesture the same way that you have been up until this point. But then once you're done the gesture, pick a place to start. Again, clusters of joints are really good places to start. Pick 2 joints as your arbitrary starting point. Compare the angle between those things, set the scale of your drawing, and then start to triangulate out from that particular point in much the same way that I was attempting to show here. Any questions before we move off into the wild?
We have to connect them, right, Jay?
What's that?
We have to connect them, right?
Connect the dots?
Yeah.
Basically, yeah.
No, thank you.
Like this.
Oh.
And my suggestion would be not to wait until the end. Like, don't do this. All right, here's a dot, here's a dot, here's a dot, here's a dot, there's a dot, there's a dot, there's a dot. Like, don't do that and then try to come back and connect them, because what you're missing here is volume. So you've got no idea like how thick this is, or how thin this is, right? Or how thick this is, or how, you know, it's like that volume adds a significant amount of ease to developing the pose. So try to turn those into those simple geometric shapes as you're going along, as unsatisfying as they look, because it will make it easier to develop the pose a bit quicker. Okay, let's give that a go. So Miss Tiffany, let's do 2 10-minute poses, please. Okay, so let's feeds and chairs back up and let's see what happens here. Have any of you guys actually used the recordings?
I don't think I still know how to find them.
Well, they're there. So hopefully somebody's getting a benefit from it. Whatchamacallit. Okay, so we got 2 different levels of accuracy. Let's blow this up for our purposes. Say there's my knee, base of foot. Let's just pretend I've done all of this measuring stuff here. And I've left with something deeply unsatisfactory as a drawing, right? But gives me an opportunity to make things a little bit more accurate, a little bit more easily. Okay, so let's say that this is where we're at. Now, another way that you can make things more accurate is by taking measurements to and from in the exact same manner, really specific spots, as opposed to really general spots. Hold on, I got this extreme avant-garde angle going in that I don't like. Those points of reference fall into in a few different categories. The most easily recognizable are what are called T-intersections. A T-intersection is exactly what it sounds like, because where 2 points of reference, or 1 point of reference is caused by 2 lines intersecting each other to create something that kind of looks like a T. So for instance, where the calf and the hamstring intersect with each other here, that can be a really particular point of reference. So now rather than measuring from a knee that has all of this nebulous space in here to measure from, now you've got something exact to measure from. So I might have another T intersection here between the hamstring and the inside of the shin. So when I take the angle from here to here, that angle is no longer in question in terms of where I might be misconstruing that angle by measuring from here and then measuring from to here or some other place in between. Now you're measuring from 1 point to a very specific point. So if I want to find the intersection point between the top of the foot and the back of the Achilles tendon, I take an angle from this point to that point and an angle from this point to that same point. Where those 2 lines cross over gives me that position. Now, importantly, all that does is tells you where those points of reference are with respect to each other and gives you a much more accurate sense of proportion. It tells you nothing about how things change direction inside those points. Right, so other useful points of reference, right, are things called endpoints. Endpoints would be, say, where the crease of this hamstring ended, say that it was right there. That's a really particular point. And so you can use that as a way of referencing where this and that are with respect to each other. Other things, right, might be referred to as nodes. Nodes are kind of just easy ways of saying, like, identifying marks in the body. So things that are small enough to be measurable to and from. The corner of the mouth, a nostril, a pupil, right, your ear hole, an identifying mole. Right. Interestingly enough, I never include this in portraits that I do of myself. I think I'm embarrassed of it. I started to the last couple of years, so now it's there forever, which makes it look like I've grown a mole over the last couple of years, which I haven't. I've always had this thing. It's a nice little biographical detail for you to take into the future. Okay, so the other thing, and which is a little bit more difficult, are called tangent points. Tangent points or quadrant points, depending on who it is you're talking to. Now, these things are a little less useful and to kind of be used in absence of all of these other points. So they're really useful in like places like the back, right, or the torso, right, when you start getting away from the nipples and the navel. Quadrant point, if you think about it in relationship to a circle, if you put that circle inside of a box, that circle in that box or that square would intersect at 4 tangent points or quadrant points, hence the name. So basically a quadrant point or a tangent point is the apex of any curve. So if the apex of my curve of the knee is, say, right about there, I can now take a measurement here and here to get a sense of where that has to exist with respect to that. Likewise, you can have a much smaller quadrant point, say like the bump underneath the kneecap as it goes into the tibia. If I want to take a measurement from here to here, you now have a way, right, of comparing those two things to each other. Now, let's relate this. So this would be a way of, say, like developing positive space based loosely on the gesture and this initial volume that I put in for the knee. I can loosely decide that this is where the top of the knee has to be, or this is where the kneecap is going to be. And I can take these smaller measurements to that and then confirm their position relative to this, but also relative to each other. In coordination with this, using chunks of negative space are really useful to do this, because all I've basically done here is identified where this and this point have to exist to each other. It said nothing about what the calf looks like, what the top of this foot looks like, what the heel looks like, right? Where the ankle might be embedded inside, what this calf looks like, how big of a hamstring or a bulge the hamstring creates. It says nothing about that. So if I want to find this point here, I can do the exact same thing as if I was doing this, except now you're doing it from this specific point to that specific point, and also from there to there. And what that essentially does is it breaks this overall space up here into something a little bit more manageable. So rather than guessing where all of these changes of direction take place, now you could, safely kind of guesstimate about what that section of the foot looked like. Right? If you wanted to know, say, where this curve of the calf existed, you can now do something like this. So it's still triangulating the pose. You're just doing so on a smaller scale, which makes breaking up this chunk of negative space a little bit easier. Right? As you start to try and identify what that chunk of negative space or positive space looks like a little bit more accurately. Now, I've been doing this for a long time, so this just kind of makes sense to me. I am very well aware that over the last number of years teaching this, that this does not necessarily make intuitive sense to people theoretically, let alone practically. So if this makes sense to you theoretically, there's probably a good to fair chance that this is probably going to stop making sense when you try to do it practically. And if this doesn't make sense theoretically, it's a irritating road for it to make sense practically. Now, the benefit of doing this on this granular level or even on this general level is that you're effectively training yourself to see what's actually in front of you, which makes it much easier to draw your gestures, right? Your 2s, 5s, 20-minute poses more accurately, more quickly, more efficiently, because you just start seeing the world like this, right? You start seeing relationships like this a lot more naturally. So what I'm going to do is, Miss Tiffany, if we get to a 15-minute pose, I'm going to do a 15-minute pose and show you how I would approach that particular thing using this particular method. And then you guys are going to do probably some 20-minute poses at that point and apply the same thing and create accurate and amazing drawings. How's that sound for everyone?
Sounds good.
It's always the same thing. I think I ask the questions now just for my own amusement. I know that I'm not going to get responses. Not that there were a lot of responses in person, but there were like head nods and like gestures, like thumbs up, right? Shit like that. General shuffling of approval.
My problem is I nod, but I'm not on camera. So it doesn't matter.
I assume that you guys are all nodding, sometimes applauding. Who knows what you're doing? I generally think that there's probably like an avalanche of approval from the other side of the camera.
It's just a lot of work to unmute yourself to agree to something.
This is true too.
15 minutes?
Pretty pleased and thank you. Okay, so again, the importance of the gesture. If I haven't already made it apparent, in all of the time that we've shared together, I have done my job poorly in terms of its importance. But I think at this point, it probably doesn't lack. Got the, I think it's the first song of the very first Tool album stuck in my head.
These are 20 minutes, right, Jay?
These are 20 minutes, but this is my demo of that 20 minutes. So do with that demo as you so see fit.
Hey.
Okay, so there's my gesture, right? Just something to start with. Now, again, I can mix and match these things. I can start with this shoulder here, and then take an angle from that shoulder to this elbow, set this proportion, set this volume, and that's going to make it a little bit easier for me to take an angle from here to this wrist, and then another angle from this shoulder to this wrist, where those two things cross over, gives me the position of that wrist. And if that thing disagrees with the thing that I've set up before it, i.e., right, where my forearm was initially, this wins, right? So effectively, right, what it is that you've done with your gesture doesn't exist, right, at this point. It's just a way to start that particular thing. Now, if I want to get a bit more granular about this, I can now arbitrarily decide based on this that this is where the T intersection is between the top of my wrist and the top of my hand. And then I can take an angle from here to where the T intersection between the wrist or between the bicep and the side of the torso. I'm double checking that. And again, just like I've decided how far apart these two things were right at the beginning, I'm now deciding about how far apart these two things are at a slightly more accurate level based on that gesture or that initial structural form that I've set up. So now I'm locking that proportion into place. So now if I want to go back and find this point at the intersection between your forearm and your upper arm, I do the exact same thing. I'm just doing it on a more granular level. Rebecca, if you can kill your video feed for right now, please. Thank you. I did that by accident. As I go from here to here, I now have a rough idea of this angle, and then I do the exact same thing from here to here. Those two things end up lining up pretty accurately with each other. Adjusting that a little bit. So now those two things line up. Now with the inside of the bicep, there's not really much to do there because that difference or that line is pretty simple. That movement's pretty simple. But as I come off of this portion of, or this portion of the forearm here, and as I come off of this portion of the forearm here, there's a difference, right? And that difference is created by that muscle in the forearm that overlaps right from the outside of the left side of the upper arm to the thumb side of that arm. So now I've made that a little bit easier to draw. It also now gives me a way to identify how much space is in here off of this angle, coming off of the wrist into the back of the hand. Now I want to know where this point is. I can take an angle from here or an angle from here to that same point. This point's probably going to be a bit easier because it's more distinct from those ones. So I'll take an angle from there to there, double check it. And where those two lines cross over gives me that point, which now makes it easier to start drawing my torso because the torso now has to come up at that angle until it hits the bottom of the bra. Right? And the bottom of the bra is going to sit, or the bottom of the top sits right about there with respect to that point and to that point. And now I want to take an angle from here straight up, because that's now going to tell me what the angle of the torso is in that spot. And then there's a little tiny chunk of the pectoral that is then moving down at this angle that then completes that chunk of negative space. So that's now giving me a much more accurate idea of what that chunk of space looks like. I can do the exact same thing to define positive space. So if I want to find the thickness of the hand, I take an angle from this T intersection to the T intersection of the bottom of the hand and the side of the hip. And then take another angle from this point to that exact same point. Where those two lines cross over gives me the position of where my hand enters into the hip and where my hip appears from the underside of the hand. Where does the wrist change direction? As I continue that angle out and then take another angle to this quadrant point, that gives me that point. Where is the elbow? Take an angle from this point to that quadrant point of the tip of the elbow, and then take another angle from here out to there. That gives me a rough idea of where the angle of the elbow is. Right? And then I can start to modify that to make that a little bit more accurate. Now, if I wanted to say come up here and establish the thickness of the shoulder, this doesn't work very well because I don't really have a good angle to measure back to. So rather than moving up from here, I move over in this direction to find, say, this endpoint of this top of the pectoral and the intersection with the arm. So I can take an angle from this point straight over, and then another angle from this point up to there. Where those 2 points cross over gives me that position. Now, if I wanted to find this volume, easiest way for me to do that is take an angle from here and an angle from there to the point where the ponytail intersects the trapezius. So if I do that, that angle is kind of like that, kind of more like that. And this angle is kind of more like this. Actually, even more so like that. I'll double check it with this, which lines up like that. And that pushes my trapezius and my shoulder down to right about there. So I'm missing that amount of volume, which is not an insignificant amount of space. Now, this and this are relatively easy to kind of hook up because a simple shape locks that into place. Likewise, I can kind of guesstimate about how thick my arm is on that side. And you can use a really general sense of accuracy by comparing these things along a horizontal volume to start to lock in where your shoulders are. Point is that now I've set a lateral proportion because this and this now relate to each other along something that's proportionate that connects them together. And also, right, you can see it's like how kind of like the minutia make this a lot easier to draw accurately, but you don't have to be that accurate all the time. It's actually easier to draw this whole section by taking that big measurement from top of the shoulder to over here and guesstimating this. Likewise, where this elbow would be over here would be significantly easier for me to just start by doing something like this. And so that I can then use, say, where the bottom of the top is going to be, which would make it easier for me to draw the bottom of the shadow shape of the breasts right underneath that or on top of that. Right? And then start to augment all of the other stuff in and around. So all this effectively does is now locks this stuff into place so that if I had time and wanted to, this could be the area that I started to focus on. right, and start to make a little bit more, not only accurate, but also just more interesting to look at, because now rather than being a collection of parts and points, you've got something that can act as a pretty stable foundation to start to put details like shade and shadow reference into. More controlled and detailed graphic line value if you wanted to go in that direction. This makes it easier to start to carve into that initial shape and get something that feels significantly less robotic. And at the very least is just, once you get the hang of it, so to speak, a really effective way of just making your drawing a hell of a lot less frustrating towards the end sections of the drawing. And I'm sure that you guys have all experienced this. I sure as shit know that I have. That the worst thing to have as an experience towards the end of a long drawing, especially one that you think is going well, is to finally take a moment towards the end and look at your drawing and recognize that proportionally and positionally things are irretrievable, right? Because you haven't controlled these proportional relationships early enough, right, in the process. Okay, so this basically takes care of that as a potential. So for instance, like I can look at this pretty clearly and see that that arm is way too thick for the proportions that I've set up. And I think the shoulder is a little too high for the proportions that I've set up. Right, and this basically just supplements the other stuff that we've been doing. And so it isn't an entirely separate way of developing the pose. It's another tool that is incredibly useful depending on what it is that you're trying to do. This, by the way, is, you know, if you're drawing realistically academically, this is what people refer to when you're drawing academically. Trying to get things accurate, right, and as accurate as is possible. And as you can probably kind of gather, it's almost an entirely different skill set than is drawing is drawing gesturally or drawing for predominantly animation purposes. But if you can have both of those skill sets, it's pretty formidable in terms of what it is that you're able to do as you apply it to, you know, your own projects in the future. Okay, thanks, Tiffany. That was great. So if, for instance, inside 20 minutes, this is all that you got done, right? But what you got done was perfectly accurate, that's all right. The goal is not to finish the entire drawing inside 20 minutes. The goal is to get what it is that you're studying as accurate as possible. This not only obviously makes your drawing more accurate, but it also increases your familiarity with not only this process, but also with the area that you're studying. What does an elbow look like? What does a hand look like? What does a shoulder girdle look like, right? What does a torso, pelvis look like, etc. And so you gradually start to develop your familiarity with how to draw these things both quickly and slowly by a prolonged study, right, with longer drawings. So it's not not even entirely. It's not unclickable to what it is that you guys are going to be doing, right, because of that degree of, I don't know, observation that it essentially forces you to develop. Okay, thus ends the sermon.